In the winter of 1959, deep within the frozen Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a group of 9 experienced hikers set out on what should have been a routine expedition. They were young, skilled, and well prepared for one of the harshest environments on Earth. Led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, the team had completed difficult expeditions before and knew the dangers of the wilderness. Their goal was simple: reach Ural Mountain, complete the journey, and return home with stories of another successful adventure. Before leaving, Igor promised to send a telegram as soon as the expedition was over. Friends and family expected nothing unusual. The group carried food, cameras, journals, maps, warm clothing, and every piece of equipment needed to survive the brutal Siberian winter. The hikers laughed together, took photographs, and documented every step of their journey. Nothing in those final images suggested that history was about to remember their expedition for a completely different reason. As the days passed, however, no telegram ever arrived. At first, nobody worried. Delays were common in such remote mountains, but as more time passed, concern slowly turned into fear. Rescue teams were finally organized to search the frozen wilderness. What they discovered would become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Their abandoned tent was found ripped open from the inside. The footprints leading away from the campsite told a story that made no sense. And the fate of the 9 hikers would inspire decades of investigations, conspiracy theories, and scientific debates that continue to this day. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. On January 23, 1959, the expedition officially began. The team departed by train from the city of Sverdlovsk, carrying heavy backpacks filled with food, cameras, climbing equipment, and enough supplies to survive weeks in the wilderness. For these young adventurers, this was more than a journey. It was an opportunity to earn the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering, a distinction reserved for only the most experienced hikers. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all students or recent graduates with extensive experience in winter expeditions. They trusted one another completely, having faced dangerous conditions together before. After several days of travel by train, truck, and finally on skis, they reached the edge of civilization. Beyond that point, there would be no roads, no villages, and no possibility of outside assistance. The Ural Mountains stretched endlessly before them, covered by deep snow and battered by freezing winds. Daytime temperatures remained far below freezing, while nights became even more unforgiving. Despite the harsh conditions, spirits remained high. The hikers joked with one another, sang songs around their campfires, and carefully documented the expedition with photographs and personal journals. One member of the team, Yuri Yudin, began suffering from severe pain caused by a chronic illness. Realizing he could not continue, he made the difficult decision to return home. His teammates watched him disappear down the snowy trail, promising they would see each other again in just a few weeks. None of them could have imagined that Yuri Yudin had just become the only member of the expedition who would survive. The remaining 9 hikers continued deeper into the mountains, unaware that every step was bringing them closer to one of history's greatest mysteries. By February 1, 1959, the expedition had reached the eastern slope of Khalat Syakhl, a remote mountain whose name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, translates to Dead Mountain. The name had nothing to do with ghosts or legends. It simply reflected the harsh landscape, where almost nothing could survive the relentless winds and freezing temperatures. Snowfall had intensified throughout the day, reducing visibility and making navigation increasingly difficult. Rather than descending into the shelter of the nearby forest, Igor Dyatlov made the decision to establish camp on the exposed mountainside. The group carefully pitched their large canvas tent directly into the frozen slope, cutting into the snow to create a level surface. It was a technique they had practiced many times before. As darkness settled over the mountain, the temperature dropped to nearly minus 30 degrees Celsius. Powerful winds swept across the open hillside, shaking the tent with every passing gust. Inside, the hikers removed their heavy boots, organized their equipment, wrote in their journals, and prepared for another ordinary night in the wilderness. Some laughed, Others exchanged stories. One camera captured what would become the final known photographs of the expedition. Outside, the mountain was completely silent. There were no villages for dozens of kilometers, no lights, no roads, only endless snow stretching into the darkness. Sometime during that night, something happened. No one knows exactly what the 9 hikers saw, heard, or believed, but whatever it was terrifying enough to make every one of them abandon the safety of their tent within seconds. When rescue teams finally reached the campsite weeks later, they found something that made no sense. The tent had been slashed open from the inside. When the hikers failed to return on schedule, concern slowly spread among their families and the university. At first, officials believed the group had simply been delayed by severe weather. But as the days passed without any message, a large search operation was finally organized. Volunteer students, experienced mountaineers, soldiers, and later even aircraft joined the search across the frozen Ural Mountains. On February 26, nearly a month after the expedition had begun, rescuers spotted something unusual on the snow-covered slope of Khalat Siakal. It was the team's tent. As they approached, the scene became increasingly disturbing. The tent was partially buried beneath snow, but it was still standing. Inside, the hikers' backpacks remained neatly arranged. Their cameras were still there. Their journals had been left behind. Warm clothing, food, and personal belongings remained untouched. Most shocking of all, the tent had been cut open from the inside. Investigators followed a series of footprints leading away from the campsite. The tracks suggested the hikers had not been running. Instead, they appeared to have walked calmly down the mountain. Many of them barefoot or wearing only socks despite temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius. Nearly a mile away, beneath a large cedar tree, rescuers discovered the first 2 bodies. A small campfire had been built there. The branches above the tree were broken several meters high, suggesting someone had desperately climbed into the tree, possibly searching for something, or trying to escape something. Over the following weeks, additional bodies were found scattered between the cedar tree and the abandoned tent, as though some members of the group had attempted to return to camp. Months later, when the snow finally began to melt, the last 4 hikers were discovered deep inside a nearby ravine. What investigators found on those bodies only deepened the mystery. The official investigation only raised more questions than it answered. Some of the hikers had died from hypothermia, a tragic but expected outcome after fleeing into the freezing night without proper clothing. Others, however, displayed injuries that puzzled experienced investigators. Several victims had suffered powerful internal trauma, including multiple fractured ribs and severe skull fractures. Yet, remarkably, there were almost no external wounds that would normally accompany such devastating injuries. Medical examiners compared the force required to cause these injuries to that of a high-speed automobile collision. Adding to the mystery, there was no evidence of a violent struggle inside or around the campsite. The footprints leading away from the tent belonged only to the members of the expedition. No tracks from attackers, wild animals, or unknown individuals were ever documented. Investigators also found traces of radioactive contamination on some articles of clothing. Although the levels were relatively low, the discovery fueled decades of speculation. As news of the strange findings slowly spread, theories began to emerge. Some believed the hikers had been caught in a secret Soviet military weapons test. Others suggested an avalanche had forced the group to flee their tent in panic, even though the slope showed little evidence of a large avalanche, and the tent itself remained partially standing. There were claims of mysterious lights seen in the sky around the same time, leading some to speculate about experimental rockets or other unexplained phenomena. More imaginative theories spoke of secret government operations, unidentified flying objects, or even unknown creatures roaming the remote wilderness. Over the decades, scientists proposed additional explanations, including powerful katabatic winds capable of producing terrifying low-frequency sounds, known as infrasound, which in theory could trigger intense feelings of panic and disorientation. Despite countless investigations, documentaries, books, and scientific studies, no single explanation has been able to account for every piece of evidence found on that frozen mountain. More than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. More than 6 decades have passed since 9 experienced hikers vanished into the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains. Over the years, countless investigators, scientists, historians, and independent researchers have returned to the evidence, hoping to solve a mystery that has fascinated the world for generations. In 2019, Russian authorities officially reopened the investigation using modern forensic techniques and computer simulations. The following year, they announced their conclusion. The hikers had most likely been caught in a rare type of avalanche. According to the report, a slab of compacted snow may have collapsed onto their tent during the night, forcing the group to escape immediately into the freezing darkness. Years later, independent researchers used advanced computer models to show that, under very specific conditions, such an avalanche could indeed have occurred on the slope where the expedition had camped. For many experts, this explanation answered some of the long-standing questions surrounding the case. But for others, important mysteries still remain. Why were some of the injuries so unusual? Why did the hikers travel nearly a mile away from the tent before attempting to survive? Why did some members try to return while others remained near the forest? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what frightened 9 experienced mountaineers enough to leave the safety of their shelter in temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius? Perhaps every detail will never be fully understood. Perhaps the mountain still keeps some of its secrets. Today, the place where the tragedy occurred is officially known as Dyatlov Pass, named in honor of expedition leader Igor Dyatlov and the 8 companions who never returned home. The snow that once covered their footprints has long since disappeared, but the mystery they left behind continues to inspire investigations, scientific debate, and endless speculation around the world. Sometimes history doesn't leave us with clear answers. Sometimes it leaves us with questions. And perhaps that is what makes the Dyatlov Pass Incident one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Thank you for watching Forgotten Files. If you enjoy exploring history's greatest mysteries, forgotten disasters, and untold true stories, consider subscribing for more documentaries every week.